All right, good morning and thank you for joining us today. I am Olivia Baroni with SBP. We do have a large group today, so we just ask that you keep your mic muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please type them in the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and I will be sending out the slides from today's presentation, so look out for that in your inbox later this afternoon. SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. As part of that goal, we've partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders and the general public to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. SBP has 5 interventions: rebuilding efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy changes and improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to our Senior Government Advisor, J.R. Sanderson.
And thank you, Olivia. My name is J.R. Sanderson. I'm the Senior Government Advisor for SBP. I am a retired U.S. Army officer with a 30-plus year career, 27 years as commissioned officer. Several years after that, I became the Chief of Staff for the South Carolina Department of Motor Vehicles, and then was fortunate to be the former director of the South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office, now called the South Carolina Office of Resiliency, during Hurricane Joaquin in 2015. Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricane Florence in 2018. And over the last several years, we've seen quite a bit here in the advised work that we've done for this great company called SBP. Proud to be a part of this organization. I'm joined today by Ms. Michelle Stinnett. She's out in Colorado. And Michelle is also the director of our Resiliency and Recovery Fellowship Program. And she will be managing the chat box if you have any questions or comments. Folks, today we're going to talk about building a culture of preparedness. This is a multifaceted presentation. So if you have any questions or comments, please just tap them into the chat box. Let's go to the next chart, please. So we basically have 3 goals here. The first is pretty straightforward. We need to identify, understand, and reduce exposure to disasters that are happening across the nation. The second is we've simply got to enclose the insurance protection gap. And the third, of course, is that we need to build a culture of preparation in our society. All of this leads us to center around a safe home. Next chart, please. I'd like to ask you to think about this particular question. Are we prepared? And when I say we, I'm talking here about us as individuals, us as local communities, and us as state governments. And certainly the federal government has a major play in this. And I'd just like you to ask yourself, are you prepared right now and fortified against natural disaster? Because folks, we are now in the hurricane season, and certainly we're in the wildfire season out west. With all kinds of potential bad things happening to us in the future. Let's go to the next chart, please. So let's ask ourselves here specifically, what is the threat? And as we think about what is the threat, let's kind of try to put it into some measurable boxes that we can use and think about. Let's go to the next chart, please. So what we will say to you is that we certainly have a looming natural disaster threat. That natural disaster threat can come in the form of wind-driven rain from hurricanes and tornadoes. It can come in the form of wildfires. It can come in the form of flooding. Folks, it could even come in the form of an earthquake. So we have a wide variety of natural disaster threats. We also have critical infrastructure failure. Critical infrastructure is what holds us together, right? And that can be named in a variety of sources. Primarily, though, I think most Americans would say that is the power grid and the transportation network. Both of those networks are certainly subject to cyber attack, and it would be unusual if we watched the news today and did not see some major cyber attack taking place. Down at the very bottom in the right-hand corner is the big ugly down there called war, which we haven't thought about as a nation in many years, and that's a good thing, and we kind of want to put that out of the way. But we need to ask ourselves, are we prepared? Are we prepared for, at the individual, local, community, and state level against all of these things? Certainly, critical infrastructure failure can happen from a cyber attack or from a natural disaster. But either way, it's something we need to think about as citizens. Let's go to the next chart. So what I would ask you in terms of a first question is this: Are you prepared to lose electric grid power for up to 14 days? Are you prepared in a safe home to be able to do all of these things and put yourself in a position to be successful for you and your family? And we're going to talk about all these as we go on. And specifically, we'll also spend quite a bit of time here talking about building a safe, resilient, and secure home. Let's go to the next chart, please. So you may say to yourself, wow, I haven't had a power outage in a long time. And that may very well be true, folks. It is, we are very, very good and have a wonderful, stable power grid here. And this is certainly no negative connotation whatsoever against the brave folks who go out and repair power lines and try to turn power on after a natural disaster. But the truth is, you can see on the right-hand side that even though we only have an average power outage in the USA in 2020 was about 8 hours. Folks, if you get hit with a natural disaster, you could be out of electric grid power for quite a while. And all of these over here on the right-hand side, I think would line up and show you that these could certainly happen at the regional and county level, where we can have major power outages for long periods of time. And folks, this does cause quite a bit of heartache and pain and suffering. The four major causes of power outages, certainly number one is the natural hazard, the natural disaster. The second very well could be mechanical failure. The third, operations. And as we've already spoken about in terms of cyber or other attacks, it could be a human attack. Let's go to the next chart, please. So what I will ask you to think about is and consider is how prepared are you as a citizen? Because what we will say to you from the SBP advise world is, folks, we need crisis prepared citizens. We need citizens who are completely prepared to face all of the things that we just talked about. Let's go to the next chart, please. And what I would say is that I'm not certainly here trying to turn anybody into a survivalist. All we're trying to do is ensure that we do have the ability to have prepared citizens. And the reason we need that is we need more and more citizens who are simply prepared against the threats that may come toward them at the local level, at the community level, and certainly to protect our own homes and properties. What we want is a whole lot of citizens who all they need is accurate information. Let's go to the next chart. So what we're going to find is that if we have the vast preponderance of our citizens who only require good information, then that will allow government forces to focus on those who cannot recover themselves. The stated great mission of SBP is to reduce the time between disaster and recovery. So what we say to folks is we want government to be able to focus all of its efforts on those who are not going to be able to recover themselves. Government simply does not have the resources to provide food, water, and shelter to everyone in the event of a major natural disaster. And so when people ask us, they say, well, okay, what does that mean? Who would you serve? I immediately go to quite a bit of scholarship on this issue in the social vulnerability world. And that is, I would focus on those who have a disability, those who are age 65 and older, and those who have children in the home age 5 and below. If you are in those categories, you will have a hard time responding to a disaster, and you will certainly have a hard time subsequently recovering from that disaster. So we really need to focus our efforts here. We do not have the capability to do everything for everybody, and I just think that's one of our major advised talking points here. Let's go to the next chart. So now we're going to talk a little bit about at the individual level. What do I need? What do I need as an individual citizen in this idea of building a culture of preparedness? So let's go to the next chart. And what I would say to you is the most prominent, most likely thing that would happen would be the loss of an electric grid. And in the case of a loss of the electric power, I just need you to think about right now, it's 11 o'clock here in the Eastern Standard Time Zone, 11:09. And what I would say to you is, my goodness, think about how much electricity you've already used this morning. And what would your life be like if you did not have that? So let's go to the next chart and try to break this down a little bit. What I can say, and this is just simply based upon quite a bit of research on behalf of myself and the great advice team at SBP, is we believe that, and again, pretty good scholarship here, we believe that you're going to need 1 gallon of water per day for each adult in the household. Now, clearly, this is a compounding math problem. If you have more adults in the household, you're going to need more gallons. And we would again times that by 14 because we think that's a reasonable number, especially if you were to have a regional power outage that could last for quite a while. You can argue all day long on the 2,000 calories per day. We have left that as our marker. We believe 2,000 calories a day is good. A lot of people say to me, my goodness, that's way, way high. Some people, I guess, would say that's way low. But we're going to leave it there at 2,000. We believe that's right. That's non-perishable food. You got to be able to eat. I'd also point out to you that there are a lot of essential medicines out there, especially now in my baby boomer generation, if you will, that there are critical life-sustaining medicines, and we need to have a 14-day supply of all of those medicines. Now, people will often say, well, my goodness, I don't have the storage space. I've been in disaster recovery for a long time, and I've been in a lot of homes, and I can tell you, yes, you can find the space. I've been in hoarder homes, so yes, you can find the space. What we coach people on here is either build a prep closet or begin storing these things underneath your bed. We think those are pretty viable options in terms of thought processes in order to how to protect yourself, your family at the individual level. Let's go to the next chart. Now, there are some other must-haves that we do need to have a conversation about. The first is a sustainable heat source. This is absolutely critical when you think about it. I will give you the example relatively recently of Texas losing the power grid. And when the power grid went down, subsequently, we ended up losing quite a bit of piping underneath houses. And we had just a tremendous problem throughout the entire state of Texas. And it was in the middle of winter. So let's don't presuppose that all storms come in the summertime when it's warm. So we're going to need a sustained heat source that we can use for fuel. Folks, you're going to need first aid supplies. Without being overly crazy about this, just presuppose it's like COVID and that the hospitals are full and the drugstore's closed. And do you have an adequate amount of first aid supplies? One of the positive things that we will say that we see across America today is that most Americans now have some communication listening device. They have the capability to listen to emergency broadcasts, to understand public messaging. So we're seeing that as a positive sign. But up here in the upper right-hand corner, we've got ourselves a problem, and that is the sanitary plan. Folks, you need to think through this. This is especially critical in urban areas and suburban areas. And a lot of options up here: packet latrines, bucket latrines, chemicals, trench latrines. But you need to have a sanitary plan. Because what I'm going to tell you is that, when your toilet stops flushing, you're going to begin to start having problems in your own home, and this is going to compound quickly across the community. And we'll talk just briefly about this in a little while. Let's go to the next chart. So the next thing you have to ask yourself is, okay, I see these things that I have to have as an individual now. How would I go about protecting my home? And we'll try to answer that question as best we can. Let's go to the next chart. So what are the threats, right? So the very first threat that I think that is probably the most prevalent is the high wind threat. And the high wind threat can certainly bring wind-driven rain, which we see in all hurricane and tornado events. These will also cause and enable flooding. Flooding is the most dangerous. Most people are going to if you're caught in a flash flood, that is a dramatic, truly dramatic event. And so that's always a possibility. Wildfire, my colleague and friend, Michelle Stinnett out in Colorado has dealt with much of this. And of course, at the bottom is this thing called an earthquake. And we're kind of going to talk about now living in a safe home against all of these threat areas. And we'll just speak about them briefly. There is quite a bit of documentation out there, and I'd ask that you take the time to study it for yourself and do what's best for you and your family. Let's go to the next chart. Here specifically, we're going to speak specifically up front about high wind events. Now, this could be wind-driven rain. This could be tornadoes. This could be hurricanes, as we are now in hurricane season. And the very first thing that we say to folks inside the home is, folks, you have absolutely got to review your insurance capabilities and your policies. You got to know what you're paying for and what you're going to get. Can it have a reasonable expectation that you're going to get paid back for? We ask always to document the contents of your home. We ask that you do this over and over again. If you lose power, unplug, build yourself a safe room, protect your windows and glass, And folks, I don't know how many disasters I have been in where garage doors have just been smashed in everywhere we go as we drive through a disaster impacted area. Reinforcing garage doors is important because oftentimes that's where the flooding happens at in homes. So outside of the home, we will spend just a minute here talking about fortifying your roof, but we have to be good homeowners about this. We have to remove dead trees, dead limbs. We've got to secure objects. One of the things about high wind events certainly is that if we have rocks and gravel around our home and we do end up with a hurricane force or tornado force level wind, that stuff will get picked up and become projectiles going everywhere. So these are just things to think about. We believe strongly in securing manufactured and mobile homes to the ground. We have had great success with that. I've had great success with that in the past in South Carolina. In anchoring down mobile home units to hurricane level 2, and frankly, they hold well. So we ask that you think about these things, and if you're looking for a specific source document, we ask that you check out the FEMA Protect Your Home from High Winds document. We think that is probably the best thing out there right now in terms of a holistic look at protecting yourself from high winds. Let's go to the next chart. Now let's talk a little bit about flooding. Flooding is the most dangerous. There are some preventative measures, certainly if you have the means, and we certainly acknowledge and realize that not everybody has the means, but if you can raise your home, you need to raise your home. Installation, sump pumps and vents absolutely make a difference. I will spend a little bit of time later on talking about electrical outlets in natural disasters and the idea that if we do have a home that is inundated with floodwaters above the lowest level of electrical outlet, we drastically increase the price of repairing that home. We ask that you think about grading your home, right? I know that is something that we don't necessarily think about anymore, but the water needs to go away from your home. And so we need to think about that. When the flooding begins, when the flooding is happening, this is when we need to elevate our valuables, when we need to shut off our electricity, and we need to make sure that our gutters and drains are clear and we let the water go where it needs to go. We can use sandbags and ditches to turn water wherever we can because we're trying to protect our most valuable investment at this point. What we would also say to folks is it is absolutely critical to remove as much water as quickly as possible from a disaster damaged home, because the longer the water stays in, the more that your drywall is going to soak it up, and the more mucking and gutting, which is the ugly hard process of ripping out the guts of your home, is going to be. So we do say remove as much water as possible, as quickly as possible, and dry out as fast as you can. So let's go to the next chart and talk just a little bit about wildfire. I was very impressed with this article by a man by the name of Connor McGowan, and he basically wrote an excellent treatise here on wildfires. I'm not specifically a wildfire guy. I'm a hurricane, tornado type of guy, flood guy. But I think these are all very, very interesting. And the very first thing that he says is that if you have an asphalt roof with proper installation, you probably are going to be okay in a wildfire. And no guarantees here for anything, but the thing that he mentions in the article is the idea that we have to keep embers out of our home because everything inside your home is flammable. And oftentimes, if you think about these wonderful, brave firefighters out west who are fighting these major fires, what we see is areas and areas of green between houses that are burning. And one of the reasons for that is when that ember hits, it's going to go to the very first flammable thing it can find. And if that's a house, that's what happened. So the big thing here, of course, is to secure the perimeter. Watch the mulch. Interesting article, interesting thought here about mulch around houses and how that can catch on fire, and then create a defensible space. Now, one of the things about wildfire that is unique in the disaster recovery emergency management world is that I don't know that anything is more community oriented than wildfire protection. So something to think about there. Let's go to the next chart. And here we're just going to speak briefly about earthquakes. This is happening certainly here in South Carolina. Got a lot of people where I live, interested. The answer here certainly is to cover and hold on. What we say to folks here is the idea that you need to anchor all of your large, heavy objects in your home. And one of the things that we've noticed in the research and putting this together is that if you have an old-timey water heater, and that water heater is jarred, it could certainly come loose. And if it's not strapped and properly put in, and now you've got a flooding event inside your home after a earthquake, which would make for a pretty bad day. What I would say to you is be prepared for the aftershocks. We all know they're coming. So let's just put ourselves in a position here to where we can protect ourselves as best we can inside our home. Let's go to the next chart and speak now about a couple of different specific items. We are not spokesmen for, although we are, what's the word I'm looking for? We are certainly proponents of strong roofing in any way, shape, or form that you can get it. We will say that the most important part of a home is the roof. If you've ever been in an emergency management situation, whether it be tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires, whatever, that one of the very first things that emergency managers want to know is how many roofs did we lose? Now, there's a reason for that. If we lose our roofs, we no longer have the capability to stay in the home. We have to move out somewhere. That may be with friends and neighbors. Folks, it may very well be to a public shelter. And what we will say is that when the roofing fails on homes, then we begin sheltering operations. Now, I say this publicly every time I give this pitch. Thank God for the American Red Cross. They do an amazing job across the nation in terms of opening shelters. State governments, I think, in many places are very, very adept and adroit at this and do it very well. What we will say is shelters are very, very easy to open. Folks, they are very, very, very hard to close. Now, when you begin doing public sheltering operations, you are responsible for the food, the water, the electricity, the sanitary, the security of all those folks who are living in that public shelter. And that becomes a very, very hard thing on communities. And it's especially true if we have shelters in public schools, because we're not going to be able to open the schools or the community buildings back up until we get folks out of those shelters. So what we have found over time is that if the roof holds, we normally see people going back into homes when the floodwaters abate and the floodwaters go down. People go back into their homes now and begin this thing called mucking and gutting, dragging out all of that ugly old drywall and trying to dry everything out. If the roof is damaged, they can't go back and do that. So if you're looking for any type of silver bullet in the disaster recovery world, our answer here is it's the roof, the roof, the roof. Now, having said that, there are many low to moderate income households and those on fixed incomes, those folks around us, our neighbors who are elderly and disabled, they often cannot afford to maintain their roofs. So oftentimes this needs to be something that we think about at the community level to try to help our friends and neighbors, and certainly true with public policy. Let's go to the next chart. Now, we are proponents of this thing called fortified roofing. Fortified is a brand name. We have worked with them in the past. We believe in what they're doing, but we do not own stock in these people. I don't have any. There's no nefarious relationship here. But I do need to say to you that this is a good thing to think about. And when you're thinking about a fortified roof, what you're thinking about here is the roof is reinforced with additional bracing materials. In essence, you are attempting to tie the roof into the foundation. Folks, I have been in disaster areas where it looked as if roofs had been ripped off like a can opener, and that's a bad and dangerous thing, especially in wind events, because now every bit of that roof became a flying projectile and damaged other people's homes. Frankly, in a fortified roof, we do have a minimum thickening thickness. Decking has a minimum thickness standard, and I think that is a very, very big deal. And if certainly the roof shingles are now reinforced with a major nail pattern, and this does preclude shingle loss. And if I can hold on to the shingles, then maybe I can hold on to the decking. There's also a standard out there for fortified windows. Again, we ask people to consider these things. We think this is absolutely critical. We do also believe that in public policy, like the Community Development Block Grant for disaster recovery, that this is a good use of money to put people into fortified homes with fortified roofs, because we're into a pay me now or pay me later situation. Let's go to the next chart and talk here briefly about foundations. There are a billion ways to build a home, or to look at a home, to see a home plan, a home design. But folks, there are only two ways that homes by and large are generally built. On the left, you see what is known as a pier and beam home. This is a home with a common vernacular word called a crawl space. It may be called a pier home or a beam home. Most of the vernacular and the language, and when you talk in this world today, we would refer to it as a pier and beam home. This home is elevated. By nature, it is elevated because it has a crawl space, and it normally is going to have a vapor barrier in the bottom. And so it's higher, okay? I don't know else how to say that. But if you look over to the right, you will see a slab on grade home. Now, when you have a home that is built slab on grade, this particular home is more susceptible to flooding, and certainly because it's lower. Now, we mentioned it a little bit earlier, but most of the electrical outlets on the bottom floor of your home are somewhere, depending on your code, between 14 and 20 inches off the ground level. When that gets inundated with flooding water, we just increased the cost to repair your home dramatically because we're going to have to rip out every bit of those damaged electrical connections. So one of the things we see in the American Southeast, and this is especially true now and as we enter into hurricane season, is that many older low to moderate income homes are slab on grade. We built America, especially the southeastern United States, around mill towns. And many of these homes are simply what I call mill houses. I do not mean that in any disparaging way whatsoever. I grew up in one of them. So, but what I will say is that these are important. And so when we look at the way a house is built, we need to be able to look at the house and say, wait a minute, what is the natural inclination, the natural thought here, whether it is susceptible to groundwater flooding or not. And what we will also say is that the higher your house is, this impacts greatly your flood insurance rates. And we believe strongly in flood insurance. So if you're in a floodplain, the standard rule that has been around since I've been doing this business is you have to elevate 2 feet above the base flood elevation. And so these are things to think about if you're in and around a floodplain. Let's go to the next chart. And what we'll say here is just a point to say that coding matters. The building codes in your neighborhood matter. That matters whether you're in urban America, suburban America, or rural America, because what we have found is that homes and structures that are not built to code oftentimes directly impact homes that are built to code. And we see this constantly in natural disasters. And so this is something to think about in public policy and in everything we do in our culture of preparedness. Again, freedom-loving American speaking to you here, but what I would say to you is building it right and building it safe and ensuring that you have the right code, the right permits, and the right building inspectors is absolutely critical across the nation as we continue to build this thing called the culture of preparedness. Let's go to the next chart and speak here briefly about just a few practical, simple hurricane tips that most folks that live in the Southeast know. This is commonsensical, but I felt like it was worthy of a chart. Whenever a hurricane brews up in the American Southeast or in the Gulf Coast, you will immediately see the locals begin to fill their bathtubs. Bathtub will probably hold somewhere between 40 and 50 gallons of water, depending on how big it is. I'm sure they're bigger than that. But we can use that water for cooking and cleaning. And certainly then you'll see people go out immediately and put buckets underneath their rain catches off their roofs. And the reason they're going to do that is they're going to catch that rainwater and they're going to use it to flush their toilet. If you live out west and you live in a wildfire prone area, folks, we encourage you to have a bug out box. Take all your valuables, put it into a military style, I use the term military grade, tough box, be able to pick that tough box up, put it in the back of your automobile and drive away. The most important thing in terms of all practical tips, folks, is that individuals have absolutely got to have a plan. If you don't have a plan for what you're going to do, then you're going to be scrambling and you're going to be scrambling in the middle of a natural crisis. And that's something we don't want to see across the nation. Let's go to the next chart. And what I would ask you now to do is think about, okay, I thought about myself, I thought about my home, a couple of practical tips about my home. Now let's talk a little bit about my community and how I can do the things that I can do to help and impact my community building a culture of preparedness. Let's go to the next chart. This is probably the best thing that FEMA has done in my my opinion, right? My vast knowledge of limited knowledge, I guess, of all of this is that FEMA had come up with this idea of 7 community lifelines. Now, these are the things in the response phase when a disaster has already hit us that we now look around and we say, look, I got food, water, and shelter. I've absolutely got to have safety and security. I've got to look after some very specific things like my medical care, my communications, the transportation node. When can I get energy restored back into the community? And of course, we've always got this thing called hazardous material. Now, FEMA has proven this over and over again. And what we have seen across America is that communities who routinely rehearse this, especially at the advent of either fire season or hurricane season, are those communities that are going to have a much, much better response to the natural disaster that hits them. And they are also going to have the highest potential for recovery. And so when we think about these things, this is a big deal. In my humble but highly accurate opinion, this is one of the best things that that FEMA has done. This is good intellectual energy. This is all over the internet, and I would encourage you to not only say to your community, my goodness, we need to rehearse this. This is a governmental function, but it's also got a lot of non-governmental actors associated with it, nonprofits, and all of the folks that we have who come together in emergencies. But if we don't exercise it, we're going to fail when the time comes. So again, a great piece of good academic and I think practical application that will do us a great service here across America. However, absolutely critical that we exercise it, and communities that don't exercise it, folks, they have problems. All right, let's go to the next chart. All right, so this is an assessment right here at this point of where we're at and what we're doing. And what I will say to you is, when we look at the community preparation, what we want to have a mitigated, prepared, responded, and recovered community and all things associated with that. What do we got? Well, what we got, I think, is that we've got hit and miss in mitigation across America. Some states are doing fantastic work in terms of mitigation. Others are failing and failing miserably. In the preparation side, some communities are prepared, others are not. Response is something that we rate here as green. If you think about in the past, the great hurricanes that used to happen in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we used to have tremendous deaths from those. If you think about tornadoes, we used to have tremendous death tolls from those. But response has gotten better not only at predicting what the disaster is going to be, but talking about outcomes. And I think that response is doing better and better. So I would rate response green. Ladies and gentlemen, we are horrible in recovery across the nation. Right now, somewhere between 6 and 7 of every one of the HUD's community development block grants for disaster recovery is in a failed state, not spending enough money, not doing what it's supposed to do. And as a result of that, I think that that Americans are beginning to lose faith here, and so that's a bad thing. We need to be able to recover ourselves. If we don't recover the community, we're going to turn around one day and not have any money, because our tax base is going to evaporate and walk away. And when that happens, we're in bad shape. So let's go to the next chart here and just talk briefly about a couple of other subjects that are important at the community level. And the first here is watching the concrete. So if we get 1 inch of rainfall on a standard 3-acre parking lot, folks, America is full of standard 3-acre parking lots. They are everywhere, from church parking lots to gas stations to little bitty buildings that are everywhere. That's going to produce 1 inch of water is going to produce 81,462 gallons of water. A lot of water. If you look at the average box store, and this is not an anti-box store slide here, what I am saying is that the average box store is 15.84 acres of concrete. And in that, we give 1 inch of rainfall on that. That produces 430,000 gallons of water. I want you to now think about a standard southeastern rainstorm in which you may get 3 inches of rain in about 3 to 4 hours, or you may get 7 to 10 inches of rain over a 7 to 10 hour period, or you may get 24 inches of rain over a 36-hour period. That's a lot of water to move. So what I fully and completely realize that there's permeable concrete out there. But what I will also say is that, folks, that's not prevalent anywhere, I don't think, in America. If you had one simple culvert that was a 12-inch culvert that was trying to drain the 430,000 gallons of water, that would take 92 minutes to drain. The point behind all of this chart is that stormwater managers are really, really important. Being able to move water away from concrete is really, really important. We can blame a lot of things in society, but the truth is we've got to be able to move water away from concrete, and we've got to be able to do that as efficiently and effectively as we possibly can. Let's go to the next chart. So we always wonder why 123 Pine Street's flooding everywhere we go. Well, one of the reasons is that the concrete surfaces are putting that stormwater runoff into 123 Pine Street. It's the lowest place across America today, and this is true in certainly in rural America here in my home state of South Carolina, as well as in the big cities. We were recently with our dear friends in Detroit and Dearborn, Michigan. Folks, we need bigger pipes. We have not focused on the substructure of America. And so when we talk about knowing where the water goes and making sure that we have systems in there, and that's those systems that we are putting in are not overly filtrated, that means something to us. So we need bigger pipes and things to think about, certainly in the mitigation world. Let's go to the next chart. Just a couple of points here on constrictions. An obstructed stream is a very, very dangerous thing. That stream can be obstructed either by illegal dumping, or it can be by a weak man-made structure anywhere in the floodplain. Recently, some excellent footage on the news about Yosemite National Park being flooded, and you saw several houses moving down the river. This happens. I will give you one simple example of something that happened in my sister's hometown of Clyde, North Carolina. A flood on the Pigeon River reached up and pulled a mobile home unit completely off of its foundation, put it in the middle of the Pigeon River. It then went down the river until it hit the bridge, where it stopped and moved all of that water into the central part of the city, the little town there, until the water was strong enough to overcome the obstacle in front of it. So obstacles are constrictions. So we must, as a nation, look at these things such as poorly maintained ditches, clogged and maintained drainage pipes. Folks, culverts across America, in the last 10 years being in this business, I have spent so much time looking at culverts. So I would ask you to think about culverts, because culverts have to be able to move water, and of course, undersized and or inadequate bridging. Let's go to the next chart. So just an uncomfortable subject to talk about, but something I think is important here that we need to put into your thought processes is most of the way our sewage treatment works in America today is that it'll go from our house to a pumping station. And pumping stations then may be miles and miles away from the treatment plant. The treatment plant, folks, has absolutely got to be able to generate power. And that power then goes back to the pumping station, which pulls the subject into the treatment plant for treatment. Now, this can be miles and miles away. What we've seen over and over again is that pumping stations are often put in the middle of floodplains. Governments do that because that is the easiest place for them to be able to acquire land. It's cheaper, and they'll put in pumping stations. If a pumping station is inundated with water, if it is flooded out, we may very well have a major health concern. So at the community level, this is something we need to be thinking about across the nation. Let's go to the next chart. Let's ask ourselves now some questions about our state and what the state's responsibilities are. Next chart. And what I would say to you is, all of these things we just talked about, this idea of mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery, folks, that's all on your state government. Sometimes it gets real hard here to blame the federal government. I am a recovering bureaucrat, and I know it's easy to blame the federal government. But the truth is the federal government's going to provide the law, the assistance, the coordination, the compliance, the stewardship. Folks, it's all there. This is on your state to be able to do this and do it well and faithfully. Let's go to the next chart. And what I would say here to you is that we got to follow the rules. The federal government is not going to provide grant money that is not pretty well specified. And so it's normally almost always based in federal law. We ask that you know the standard and that you spend the money on the intended use of the money. And I think that will help states if they were to think more in line of this term. Next chart, please. We see constantly contracting in America. This is specifically true in not only all facets of emergency management, but probably most specifically and most notable in the idea of disaster recovery. when we're trying to recover from a natural disaster. And what we see basically is you get a federal resource down, some sort of a grant, money comes in, the state has it, and the state then will do one of three things. It will either write a bad contract, fail to hold a contractor accountable, or the double whammy, write a bad contract and fail to hold accountable. As a result of that, we get failure to achieve any outcomes whatsoever. This will cause a loss of public trust. When we lose that public trust, the citizen picks up the phone and begins calling political pressure, bringing political pressure to bear. Sometimes we have more federal involvement. We fire the contractor, and once we fire that contractor, we're now no longer achieving any outcomes whatsoever. Then we'll replace the state staff and start over. Without being overly cynical here, nobody ever loses a job. They simply go to be the chief potato inspector at the Department of Agriculture. And then we bring in a new team and start over, and then we go through the same cycle all over again. This is something we've got to do better at across the nation. It's one of our major talking points in our advice function when we talk to governments, and we think it's absolutely critical. Let's go to the next chart. And I would like for you just to think here on this chart for just a second. The home at the top of your screen does not have flood insurance. I fully and completely realize that flood insurance, the National Flood Insurance Program, is under some scrutiny, especially with the new FEMA 2.0 allocations and things that they're doing. But what I will say to you is a home without flood insurance touches every part of the federal bureaucracy, the state, local, and federal bureaucracy. So if I have a home without flood insurance, I'm certainly going to require local assistance, right? The locals from first responders all the way through to FEMA potentially coming out and making it a FEMA verified loss. The state may or may not, normally almost always will, get a grant to help the citizen without flood insurance, and the federal assistance. Your tax dollars will now be at work, and just think about that. Now you've got three major elements of government to someone who does not have flood insurance. The house at the bottom, however, may or may not require a FEMA verified loss. But the person does have flood insurance and they're one and done. The government no longer touches them again. Folks, we have to ask ourselves, is this sustainable? This is getting more and more expensive. And if you just think about the number of people who are touching one single house that does not have flood insurance, that number gets to be higher and higher at every turn. Let's go to the next chart. The other thing that we would say here at the state level that we think is absolutely critical are the idea that there are high capacity counties and folks, there are low capacity counties. A high capacity county has the capability of using its tax base, of implementing plans and programs. It can take in and process application. It can apply things, and certainly it does have this idea of human capital. Low capacity counties oftentimes don't have that. So as a result of that, some state governments simply want to ignore low capacity counties, and those low capacity counties as a result of that will continue to be low capacity counties. So the point we would make here is that state governments do have an inherent responsibility to assist low capacity counties. Let's go to the next chart. And here we're just going to speak briefly about the federal government piece. Next chart, please. So there are basically, after a disaster, you're going to have four major players. There are lots of major players, and I do not mean to demean any of them, but there are four that I would like to speak about here. And specifically, those are the Federal Emergency Management Agency, commonly known as FEMA, SBA, the Small Business Administration, NFIP, which is the National Flood Insurance Program, and HUD, Housing and Urban Development. These are the four major players that are going to impact and assess things that happen after a natural disaster. Let's go to the next chart. Now, what I would say to you here is oftentimes, and I am not an apologist in any way, shape, or form for FEMA, but what I would say oftentimes is that we expect FEMA to do a whole lot, and FEMA is not necessarily in a position to do a whole lot. So the National Flood Insurance Program, small business, and FEMA all generally operate under a document known as the National Response Framework. They are not designed to make you whole. They are not designed to make the citizen whole. They are designed for immediate and short-term recovery needs. And that's just the way that we have established our system here. On the other end, we have this document called the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And that framework basically takes the idea that we're going to have an intermediate recovery when FEMA is going to start that after the response phase. FEMA will come in and do some intermediate recovery, and then they're going to pass it over to HUD. And when they pass it over to HUD, HUD is long-term focus. It is the federal funding of last resort. And so we really need to ask ourselves sometimes when we're bashing FEMA or HUD, are they doing what they were intended to do? And I would say in most auspices and intellectual arguments that you really need to read the National Response Framework and the National Disaster Recovery Framework to have a good understanding of who's supposed to do what. And I think you'll find that that we're probably about right here. Let's go to the next chart. So one of the things we're seeing, though, that we're very, very pleased with is that HUD has now gotten into the mitigation world in the Community Development Block Grant. In recent Federal Register notices, they have mandated that 15% of all the money they are giving to states has to be spent on mitigation. We think that is a great thing. FEMA has dozens of programs and individual assistance, public assistance. Public assistance can be something like debris removal. Individual assistance comes in a wide variety of categories, as well as a lot of mitigation type grants. So everything now, you're beginning to see a more and more focus on mitigation. We concur with that greatly and think it is a wise and smart move. Let's go to the next chart. So 5 areas of improvement very quickly. Next chart. The very first thing that we would say is that we have to have a prepared citizen. If we don't have a prepared citizen, this entire system can quickly become overwhelming. And when it does, then we've got some major post-disaster problems. Let's go to the next chart. We must improve the idea of data sharing. We will give a huge shout out to HUD, who earlier this week came out and said that they will help in the sharing of disaster data from FEMA. When FEMA shows up in the response phase, FEMA is going to collect mounds and mounds and mounds of data. That data has absolutely got to be shared to those folks who are trying to do the recovery. If that doesn't happen, then we will have a failed recovery. So HUD is doing a good work here, and we're very proud of them and some of the work that they've done here recently. Let's go to the next chart. Folks, we absolutely must improve the consistency of the FEMA damage inspection process. What we see currently from FEMA is that you have a damage to your home as a result of a natural disaster. You apply with FEMA. FEMA sends out inspectors. We want them to give you an accurate and timely inspection, and we want that to be an adequate payout, and we want then for no further action to be required on your home. However, what we have found across America is that FEMA is wildly inconsistent in the overall damage assistance inspection process. It varies greatly from state to state. Candidly, in some instances, it varies greatly from county to county. So things to think about, something we absolutely must improve. What we want at the end here is a disaster damaged home where the home can be repaired quickly and efficiently, and we no longer touch it again. Let's go to the next chart. Folks, we believe strongly here at SBP in one application. We believe this because if you have an elderly citizen who is a disaster survivor, they're going to have to fill out a lot of different paperwork associated with FEMA, and then HUD's going to come along with a separate program. They're going to have to do it all over again. We believe strongly in one application. We believe we need to take a lot of the bureaucracy out of the system. And we think this is especially true if you've ever had to do it before with elderly citizens who really get frustrated with the bureaucracy of trying to recover themselves. Let's go to the next chart. Here we see FEMA being on the ground in the response phase by the Stafford Act, the law that establishes them, for basically 179 days. There are certainly examples when they've stayed longer, but then we wait forever on HUD to come out with a community development block grant for disaster recovery. Folks, we can no longer as a nation afford to wait for 24 months, 2 years after a disaster to even begin the recovery process. This is failure at multiple levels, and so this has got to be improved. Let's go to the next chart. So now we have to ask ourselves as we end up here, how do we build this thing called the culture of preparedness? And here we go. Number one, folks, we got to inform and educate our citizenry. We need citizens who are prepared, and this is just a general laundry list here that we think is pretty wise and smart. We ask if you think about these things, you will come to a reasonably wise conclusion of what you need to be able to do. Next chart. We go to here, folks. There's no silver bullets on preparing your home. If you are a homeowner and you have made this investment, whether you live in an apartment building or whether in large urban area, suburban area, or rural area, no silver bullets here. You need to prepare yourself and have yourself a safe home. Next chart. We believe strongly in this idea that we talked about earlier of the FEMA 7 lifelines. We believe that communities who exercise these things do well when it comes to both the response and the recovery phases associated with natural disaster. Next chart. These are the recovery support functions as listed in the National Disaster Recovery Framework. We believe strongly in housing. We believe that after a disaster, we need to look at all of these areas and see how we can recover ourselves. But what we do know is that we cannot fail in recovery, because if a community fails in recovery, it dries up and goes away. And when that happens, we lose the tax base and all kinds of bad things then begin to happen. Let's go to the next chart. We believe strongly in perpetual mitigation. We cannot just wait for a federal grant to come down to begin mitigating, to begin changing out and building bigger pipes, whether that be in Detroit, Michigan, or whether that be in Brandenburg, South Carolina. What we will say to you is that we believe strongly in perpetual mitigation. That means constant planning, constant stormwater management, constant retention, buyout, zoning. You can read the list down through here all the way over to protective infrastructure, home hardening, which we talked about with roofs, and certainly building codes play a great deal in that. Let's go to the next chart. We believe strongly that we need to tax incentivize hardened homes. So if I take my own capitalistic endeavor here, my own money, and I do everything I can to make my home safe, we believe that that is worthy, certainly at the political level, of a tax incentive, because we also know that if I don't build it right and I don't reinforce it, it may very well impact somebody else's home in my neighborhood. So we truly get ourselves into a pay me now or pay me later scenario. Next chart. We strongly encourage insurance. That's home insurance, flood insurance, and earthquake insurance. We need citizens who will say, I have insurance and I simply don't need government help. The floodplains are shifting. They're shifting rapidly. Won't get into the FEMA 2.0 yet. But having said that, we really need to be thinking about this idea of insurance. We need to close this insurance coverage gap across the nation. Next chart. And finally, we believe strongly in building long-term resiliency groups. Oftentimes, you'll see this in the literature as long-term recovery groups. Recovery's too late. We believe you need to be prepared before it gets here. You need to be able to weather the storm and then come out of it smiling and feeling good about yourself because you took the time and effort to prepare yourself. So we're after this idea of building long-term resiliency groups. We ask all citizens to be prepared. Next chart. Folks, there's thousands of sources out here. If you have the time and energy and inclination, just encourage you to get on your handheld mobile device and go to Google. You can pick up any of these. There are a lot of people. Most of the ideas out there, I think, are fairly sound and secure in terms of both the home level and individual level. The community and state level is more specialized, but at the individual level, lots of sources. Next chart. And we also have one here at our great company, SBP. It's called sbpprotects.org. We'd ask that you join us there. And then finally, next chart, please. We'd ask that you continue to follow us on our webinar series. We are grateful to have the support of the Walmart Foundation in all of these. And we're going to be doing this over the course of the next year. Here are several of these. You can go to our advised web page on sbp.org and sign up for any of these. We'd love to have you. We continue to talk about a wide variety of topics in the overall emergency management, overall public administration, overall individual and community level disaster recovery. And finally, last chart, we ask that you follow us on LinkedIn. This is our social media choice, and we ask that you follow us. If you have any questions, comments, or opposing viewpoints, we're certainly glad to discuss them, answer them, or talk about them. And now I will pass this back over to Olivia.
Thank you, JR. That concludes our presentation today. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, but if you have any questions after the presentation, please feel free to reach out to us via email. I will be sending out the slides from today, so you will have that in your inbox shortly. Well, thank you again for joining us, and thank you to the Walmart Foundation for making these education presentations possible. And we hope to see you again on future webinars. Thank you.